Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a massive theological paradigm shift based on some truly fascinating source material regarding the biblical concept of obedience. Now, if you look at a lot of scripture, obedience seems pretty straightforward, right? You obey God's commands, you get a blessing. You disobey, well, you face the consequences. But as we're going to see, the New Testament introduces language that takes the entire concept of obedience and drops it into a completely different and frankly revolutionary framework. Specifically, we're going to look at the true impact of one obedience. So let's just dive right into this opening question, because it completely shatters how so many of us grew up understanding religion, rules, and our overall standing with God. What if the coming of Christ fundamentally changed what obedience actually means? And honestly, more importantly, upon whose obedience the covenant itself even rests? Like, does it just mean keeping God's commands under a new, slightly updated rulebook? Or is there a much, much deeper shift going on here? To find the answer, the source material suggests we have to trace the movement from the heavy, requirement-based burden of the Old Covenant, which was essentially the law's due, to the finished, accomplished reality of the New Covenant, the gospel's done. We absolutely have to examine obedience within its original biblical and covenantal context. Because, as the text rightly points out, when the Bible speaks of truth, we always have to consider the context of that truth. I mean, Noah was commanded to build an ark, but you and I aren't out gathering gopher wood today, right? Context is literally everything. This brilliantly illustrates the old if-then conditional obedience of the Mosaic Law. Under the covenant made with Israel at Sinai, you have Deuteronomy 28 stating very clearly, "If thou shalt hearken diligently, all these blessings shall come on thee." Basically, if you do this, you get blessed. But right alongside that was the incredibly stark reality of the curse for failing to hearken. Later on, the Apostle Paul summarizes just how serious this arrangement was in Galatians 3, stating that anyone who does not continue in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them is cursed. So, covenant blessings and curses depended entirely on human action. Under this old system, obedience wasn't just about mentally agreeing with a set of facts. It meant flawlessly executing and doing every single requirement. The requirement was absolute. As Galatians bluntly states, "The man that doeth them shall live in them." This perfectly captures the whole character of obedience under the Mosaic covenant. You had to do what the covenant required. There was absolutely no grading on a curve. The responsibility set squarely on humanity's shoulders to perform perfectly across this vast body of commands just to maintain the covenant. And we aren't just talking about being a generally good person here. The scope of the law covered complex animal sacrifices, super strict dietary practices, purity laws, mandatory festivals, rigid Sabbath observance, civil life, moral conduct, the whole shebang. The requirement was not simply to believe the law was true, but to physically and continually do what it required. But then we get a plot twist. The source material points out that the Apostle Paul introduces a twist that changes the foundation of the covenant entirely. If obedience under the Old Covenant placed the heavy lifting entirely on the people, Paul brings in a strikingly different emphasis when he starts explaining the New Covenant. To really explain this, Paul directly contrasts humanity's failure with the defining representative act of all of history. In Romans chapter 5, he places Adam and Christ right side by side. He traces the fallout of each man's defining act. By the offense of one, Adam, judgment came upon all men to condemnation. But by the righteousness of one, Christ, the free gift came upon all men unto justification. In both cases, Paul is pointing to one single representative act with consequences that extend way, way beyond the individual who actually performed it. I really want you to pause for a second and let the sheer magnitude of this shift sink in. By the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. The determining act of righteousness is placed entirely upon the obedience of one man. This is a massive, fundamental shift in the biblical story, moving entirely from human performance to Christ's accomplishment. The standard of righteousness has entirely moved away from asking how successfully you have obeyed, and it now rests completely on what Christ himself accomplished. Philippians actually describes this perfectly, noting that Christ humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. The new covenant doesn't rest on humanity finally getting its act together and achieving perfect obedience. It rests on the one man who actually did. Which naturally leads us to ask the million-dollar question, so what does human obedience actually look like now? If Christ already did the work, does new covenant obedience just mean we keep God's commands under a different system? How do we respond to a covenant where the decisive act of obedience has already been finished by someone else? The ancient Greek texts reveal something so profound here. The Apostle Paul repeatedly uses the Greek expression hapakoe pisteos, which translates to obedience to the faith or the obedience of faith. Now, faith isn't just a new replacement law that we have to perform to earn our standing. Think about it. That would just turn faith into one final human requirement that the gospel depends on. Rather, it's a profound response to a reality that's already been accomplished. So, the crucial takeaway here is that New Testament obedience is an active progression of hearing the truth and allowing it to completely reshape your heart. As Romans 6 notes, it's about obeying from the heart the form of doctrine that was delivered to you. A word is spoken, it is heard, and the ultimate issue becomes whether or not that word is trusted. The actual Greek verb for obey, hypakuo, is built entirely around this core idea of hearing and responding to what is heard. We see this beautifully illustrated in John's Gospel. When people directly asked Jesus for a checklist of works to perform, they literally asked him, "What shall we do that we might work the works of God?" He pointed their attention entirely away from their own efforts and pointed them directly toward himself. His answer? The work is simply to believe on the one God has sent. Faith doesn't accomplish Christ's work, it responds to it. This deep connection between hearing and believing leads us right into one of the most fascinating and honestly challenging concepts in the New Testament. The source text calls it the paradox of rest, because once you actually understand that the determining obedience has already been accomplished by Christ, the response of faith is repeatedly described in the book of Hebrews as entering into rest. But listen to the deliberate cognitive dissonance this verse from Hebrews creates for anyone who is used to a performance-based religion. Let us labor, therefore, to enter into that rest. Labor and rest, sitting right there side by side. If you grew up thinking your spiritual standing was tied directly to your daily performance, this verse stops you dead in your tracks. It's an incredible paradox. How exactly does one put strenuous effort into resting? What does that even mean? Does it mean passivity? Complete indifference? Do you just sit on the couch and do absolutely nothing? Actually, not at all. The source explains that the labor is the effort required to stop trying to establish our own standing through our own works. It is ceasing from our own works, just as God did from his, and instead letting transformation arise naturally out of us. As 1 John says, we love him because he first loved us. The love and the good works, they are very real, but they are a response. They don't create the reality that precedes them. The true labor is fighting that old, deeply ingrained human instinct to earn our way and choosing instead to trust God's accomplishment. So, this brings us to how we actually apply this massive theological paradigm shift to our own daily mindset and our assumptions. How do we make sure our theology aligns with the true impact of this one obedience when we wake up on a random Tuesday? The Apostle Paul brings this directly into the realm of the mind in 2 Corinthians. Taking thoughts captive isn't just some self-help trick for suppressing negative thinking. It's about forcing every theological assumption, every high thing that exalts itself to agree with Christ's finished obedience. Notice it says the obedience of Christ. We have to bring our thoughts into captivity to the truth of what his obedience actually accomplished. If your thoughts align with any of these assumptions, if you're walking around treating sin as though Christ never dealt with it, or speaking as though God is still imputing trespasses to people, those thoughts quietly return you to the old framework of human performance, and they absolutely must be taken captive. Are you making your righteousness rest on your own successful obedience rather than the obedience of the one? Are you giving death the final word? These assumptions flat out contradict the gospel, and they've got to be discarded. We have to remember that our faith doesn't activate, complete, or cause the victory. Think about it. If it did, that would still place the determining condition back upon humanity, just like the old law. No, faith simply recognizes and rests in the incredible reality of what the one obedience already secured. Your faith doesn't defeat death. It rests in the one who already defeated it. I'll leave you with this provocative question from the source material so you can evaluate your own theology. Take a really hard look at your doctrines and your assumptions today. Do they reflect a framework where human performance still has the determining word? Or do they reflect the true, finished, and total impact of the one obedience? Thank you so much for joining this explainer.